Okay. Good morning, everyone. The United States Food and Drug Administration, FDA, with the support of the Medical Regulatory Convergence Project, co-led by USAID, ANSI, and AdvaMed, through the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence in the Medical Technology Sector, welcome you to the first session of this series of webinar sessions on utilization of voluntary consensus standards. We are very thankful to have Catherine Serrano, Besa Buniki, Scott Colburn, and Donna Walsh from FDA sharing their experiences with the medical device community, opening a great space for growing our knowledge and to take the opportunity for a fruitful dialogue. We are going to be sharing just a few housekeeping messages. So for all of us to be aware that this session is being recorded for its future availability at the Coalition's website. Simultaneous translation to English, Portuguese, and Spanish is available, so you can gain access to that through the icon that is displayed at the bottom of your screens. Microphones of all the participants are closed to prevent background noise, so we appreciate your comprehension for that, your understanding for that. We kindly request for you to post your questions through the Q&A feature that is also located at the bottom of your screens, so we will not lose them. Of course, we can use the chat tool as well, but we are running the risk of missing that as the conversation might be going. And for the speakers, we are already aligned that we appreciate all of us having our cameras open to facilitate the work of the interpreters. And as you are already aware, based on the information you have already received, this is the agenda that we're going to be following today. So without further ado, let me introduce Catherine Serrano, Katie. She's the director for FDA's Latin America office. Katie has over 15 years of experience in the medical device field, with the last 9 years spent in FDA's Office of In Vitro Diagnostics and Radiological Health in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. At the FDA, Katie has worked in a variety of technical, policy, leadership, and management positions, including joining the agency as part of the inaugural class of the Commissioner's Fellow in 2008. Working as a scientific reviewer and serving as the Diabetes Diagnostic Devices Branch Chief and the Deputy Director of FDA's Division of Chemistry and Toxicology Devices, she also served as a technical and policy lead for the agency's efforts related to laboratory developed tests. Ms. Serrano received a Bachelor of Science degree in Biomedical Engineer and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Spanish from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Before working at the Food and Drug Administration, Ms. Serrano held positions as a regulatory affairs professional at Boston Scientific Corporation and as a biomedical engineer at the United States National Institutes of Health, supporting new programs focused on cutting-edge technologies in the field of bioengineering. Katie, thank you very much for being here today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Bom dia, buenos dias, and welcome to everybody who's participating in this webinar. We are super excited to be able to provide this information and to kick off this series of webinars that really focuses on providing a better understanding of FDA's program for the use of standards and the conformity assessment for regulatory review. We so appreciate the support of the coalition in providing these educational webinars as part of the Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project. The first series of webinars was actually provided last June and focused on the Medical Device Single Regulatory Review Program, Single Audit Review Program, and we're really excited about this second series that we're kicking off today. Related to standards, I really think that one of the major lessons that we learned in the COVID-19 pandemic was that the use of standards in the regulatory process really does help us make better technical decisions at a faster pace. Having a basis for which to make technical decisions that's evident both to the regulatory authority as well as industry allows for just more rapid development of products and a more consistent understanding of how those products need to perform and how they'll be evaluated during the regulatory process. One of the comments that I want to make to the group of regulators that's participating in this conference today is that, as you'll learn as part of this webinar, the conformity assessment process and standards, the use of standards really does require participation. And so we hope that this webinar series inspires you and your regulatory colleagues to participate actively in these programs so that they can be of use to you and your regulatory decision making. And I guess without further ado, I will pass the mic to Vesa for additional information about our speakers and the program today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Sandra, for the introductions and opening remarks. My name is Vesa Bonici. I'm the International Relations Specialist for the FDA Latin America office. I will be the moderator for today's session. To start things off, I have the absolute great pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, Captain Scott Colburn and Donna Walsh. Scott Colburn, Captain of Commissioned Corps of the U.S. Public Health Service, is the Director of the Standards and Conformity Assessment Program at the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health. In this role, Captain Colburn is responsible for the Center's standards recognition and related development activities in over 600 national and international consensus standards committees. In addition, Scott oversees the program's new accreditation scheme for conformity assessment, or Asca pilot program, and the Center's efforts to optimize standards for regulatory use within the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, or IMDRF. Captain Colburn has served in numerous roles in the area of pre-market review and voluntary consensus standards development and implementation for medical devices. He's a member of numerous national and international standards organizations and serves on several policy and leadership committees. In addition, I also have the equal pleasure to introduce Donna Walsh. She's a biomedical engineer with the FDA's in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Ms. Walsh studied at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and began her engineering career as a patent examiner of medical and surgical instruments at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. In 1995, she transferred to the CDRH Office of Science and Technology, now the Office of Science and Engineering Labs, where her expertise and laboratory experience developed in the areas of mechanical testing, durability, expiration dating, lubricant compatibility, and cardiac tissue perforation. Ms. Walsh has been an active member of several national and international standard development committees, such as ASTM, ISO, AMI, where her research interests include a variety of medical device areas, but most notably medical gloves, mechanical contraceptives, transdermal drug delivery system, and cardiac leads. Since 2016, Ms. Walsh has been a senior standards advisor in CDRH Standards and Conformity Assessment Program, where she manages CDRH participation in the development and recognition of standards, currently in the cardiovascular and orthopedic device areas. Thank you again to the speakers. And with that, I will invite Scott to take the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vesa, and also Catherine and Sandra for the invite today. Hello, everyone. Buenos dias, good day, mate, cheers, howdy, all the words that we use in standards and conformity assessment. This is truly a privilege to speak with you today and speak to you about something that is extremely important to what we do here at the Food and Drug Administration in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. As Vesa mentioned, my name is Scott Colburn, and I have the privilege of being the director of the Center Standards Program, as we call it, or the Standards and Conformity Assessment Program, and in short, we call it SCAP. And I'm also very happy and honored today to be here along with one of our senior standards advisors, Donna Walsh, who has a wealth of decades of experience at FDA, both as a researcher, as a standards expert, and in numerous fields with her biomedical engineering. And we're both, like I said, very happy to be with you here today and speak to you about the various areas of what we do in standards, how it becomes a part of our regulatory science portfolio, the foundation on which we try to communicate to our stakeholders, and namely in this to industry, but also to users of our medical devices in our quest to ensure that what we do impacts patient safety in the positive way that's so important to all of us. And we really are honored to be with you today. So what we'll do is we'll move forward and walk through our agenda and discuss the topics for today. Again, I just want to, as Vesa mentioned, we're going to review areas on the basics of consensus standards, what they are and why they are valuable. And then Donna will describe how FDA manages our standards program from her vantage point as a senior standards advisor and what she does in helping oversee the various areas of how we are engaged in standards. I will, and then also talk a little bit about how we use these in device submissions from manufacturers and how we have a role in trying to bring the continuity to that. I'll then come back and discuss some information about our new program we have implemented called the Accreditation Scheme for Conformity Assessment, or Asca. And we will conclude by introducing you to the other efforts that we have within the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, or IMDRF, and share with you their research and guidance on how to improve standards for regulatory use by participating in standards development. So we'll begin by discussing consensus standards and why they're important. Let's go to the next one. ISO, or the International Organization for Standardization, defines a standard as a document established by a consensus of subject matter experts and approved by a recognized body that provides guidance on the design, use, or performance of materials, products, processes, services, systems, or persons. ISO also describes standards in a less technical fashion as the distilled wisdom of people with expertise in their subject matter and who know the needs of their organizations they represent. People such as manufacturers, sellers, buyers, customers, trade associations, users, and yes, even regulators. This definition hints at the advantages of international consensus that international consensus standards offer. As the distilled wisdom of many types of experts, they truly, with that, they truly embody a consensus on what a product should do and how it should perform. It'll be no surprise to anyone to hear that standards are a key to our economic success. The appropriate use of consensus standards encourages innovation and competition among product developers by providing a level playing field. With everyone playing by the same rules, or in this case, standards, more and better devices can be introduced into the market. Relying upon standards instead of lengthy rulemaking or other legal processes mean that product development and testing are more efficient. And since many manufacturers are global in scope, being able to use standards in multiple jurisdictions makes their jobs a lot easier. Specifically for medical devices, consensus standards do the following for us as regulators. First, the use of standards enhances regulatory science and promotes a least burdensome approach to device oversight. Standards introduce efficiencies into the pre-market review process by setting clear expectations for conformity assessment and test reporting. Using declarations of conformity with FDA-recognized consensus standards, which Donna will talk more about shortly, can increase predictability, streamline pre-market review, provide clear regulatory expectations, and facilitate market entry. Second, consensus standards promote quality. Crowdsourcing standards leads to clear performance expectations. Relying upon input from around the world ensures that we tap into expertise that no one manufacturer or regulator or clinician will have access to. Robust standards development and standards revision processes yield standards that can keep up with technological advances. Finally, using standards helps ensure that innovative, safe, and effective devices are available by optimizing bench to bedside time. We get life-saving products to the patients we all serve. Support for standards starts at the top. The World Trade Organization is the global authority on trade issues, and support for standards and their use is an enormous priority for them. The Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement from 1994 directs world economies to promote the use of international consensus standards in order to foster competition and free trade. The US federal government is an enthusiastic supporter of the WTO's position on standards and publishes the United States Standard Strategy to signal to other parts of the government, including us as regulators, and to the private sector how and why standards should be put to work on behalf of competitiveness, innovation, health and safety, and global trade. The strategy directs how standards should be developed using consensus principles, which I'll talk more about in a bit. Ultimately, the benefits are global since standards offer a universal language, so to speak, for everyone in the medical device community. I won't go into detail on this slide, but I'd like to point out how these three elements of the US federal government, our legislative branch, our executive branch, and the FDA, put standards to work. Congress passed legislation. The Office of Management and Budget issued a robust directive called the Circular A119, and FDA uses those authorities to write regulations, policies, and procedures. There is strong support for the use of standards up and down the US government. Before I go any further, I want to introduce the concept of FDA guidance. Federal rulemaking is an extremely long process that is often not appropriate for the more fast-paced environment of regulating device technologies that emerge and change quickly. Guidance documents are a common tool that FDA uses to provide our current thinking on a particular topic to the public about what we would like to see in device submissions. Guidances go through rigorous development, including public notice and comment, but can be written and updated more quickly than formal rules and regulations. Manufacturers are not required to comply with guidances, as guidances are voluntary. However, if they do not, they will need to demonstrate to the FDA why they chose a different approach. Our program has two key guidances. The first is the appropriate use of voluntary consensus standards and pre-market submissions for medical devices, which spells out how we would like manufacturers to use and cite standards in the pre-market submissions. The other guidance is titled The Recognition and Withdrawal of Voluntary Consensus Standards. This guidance outlines how FDA's standards recognition program works. Since these two guidances govern much of our standards program, Donna will share content from them later in this session. There are dozens or even hundreds of standards development organizations around the world. These SDOs write, publish, and often sell standards to product developers, conformity assessment organizations, regulators, and others. Today, we are focusing on consensus standards for many of the reasons we discussed earlier about why they are valuable. Standards developed under consensus principles are open to input from any interested person or organization. This crowdsourcing makes for better quality standards. The consensus SDOs have rigorous policies and processes in place to ensure the integrity of their work and to offer transparency and inclusiveness in every stage of the standards development process. Industry and consortium standards, while often not true consensus standards development organization, nonetheless publish important standards. However, the international consensus standards play a larger role for regulatory purposes, and we'll talk about two of them. The first is the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. It's the largest SDO in the world. There are 165 members are countries, and these countries are represented in ISO by their national standards bodies. Member countries appoint representatives to serve on ISO technical committees. Dating to 1947, ISO is based in Geneva, though it holds its meetings all around the globe. The other is the Electrical Technical Commission, the International Electrotechnical Commission, or known as IEC. And while a bit smaller than ISO, it is nonetheless of great interest to the medical device community, as it writes standards for devices with the electrical and electronic components. Founded in 1906, it is also based in Geneva and holds meetings worldwide as well. Next slide. I won't go into much more detail about these individual standards themselves, but I do want to emphasize that standards can be horizontal, which means they apply to many different products or processes. And two examples are ISO 14971 for risk management and the ISO 10993 series for biocompatibility evaluation. Vertical standards are devices or products specific, for example, like the ISO 10555 series, which addresses catheters for intravascular and other purposes, and ISO 11318, which addresses defibrillators. I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Donna Walsh, who is responsible for the smooth functioning of the Standards and Conformity Assessment Program, or SCAP at FDA. Donna will explain how SCAP is organized and how it promotes the appropriate use of our standards. Donna?
Hey, thank you, Scott. I'd like to begin by sharing SCAP's vision and mission. Our vision is as follows. The Standards and Conformity Assessment Program leads the medical device community in the enhancement and use of consensus standards in the design, development, and evaluation of health technologies across their lifespans. SCAP solves problems and anticipates opportunities to protect and promote public health through the use of high-quality, regulatory-ready consensus standards. Our mission describes how we support SCAP and FDA's visions. SCAP drives the development, recognition, and appropriate use of regulatory-ready standards for medical devices throughout their life cycles. SCAP produces and implements clear policies and programs to optimize the appropriate use of standards in regulatory processes. We anticipate the need for and lead the development of national and international consensus standards. We advance initiatives to enhance confidence in conformity assessment activities. Our work fosters innovation and standardization in technologies that provide platforms for regulatory science to meet novel challenges. And we provide leadership in outreach and global harmonization. Finally, SCAP serves as a resource for FDA staff, industry, other regulatory authorities, and Sdos. And what this mission means is that SCAP takes a total product lifecycle approach to standards. We work to promote standards, their quality, and their use. In our next slide, you will see that we have organized ourselves to do just that. So SCAP has three key functions, and they are laid out here across the total standards lifecycle: standards development, the standards recognition program, and conformity assessment. We have 16 SCAP staff and are able to tap into the expertise of hundreds of volunteer standards liaisons across FDA. SCAP itself is run like a standards developing organization with transparency, precision, and with an eye always towards anticipating future medical needs. Our overarching goal is to encourage the development and use of high-quality standards that are fit for regulatory use. So let's first take a look at standards development. We'll talk more in depth towards the end of our session about why and how regulators should participate in standards development. But briefly, FDA believes that contributions from regulatory authorities are critically important to promote individual and public health. SCAP manages over 400 center staff who, in addition to their day jobs, whether that's device evaluation, post-market analysis, or regulatory research, they participate in more than 600 SDO technical committees, subcommittees, and working groups. Sometimes we are the only regulator at the table. A key component in our standards management operation is our specialty task groups, or STGs. Our STGs align with our regulated device areas, from horizontal aspects such as quality systems and risk management to the more vertical or specific device areas such as dental devices or orthopedics. STG members are experts in regulatory policy, engineering, medicine, and science from different offices across FDA, and they serve as an internal advisory committee to SCAP. Our STGs use the consensus process throughout the life cycle of standards, from identifying the need for a new standard all the way through standards development or revision, and finally, formal recognition. So let's take a look at our recognition program. The term recognition refers to the mechanism by which FDA identifies a published standard to which medical device or product manufacturers may declare conformance in order to meet a relevant requirement, including a pre-market submission requirement. It's a formal, rigorous, and transparent process that I'll discuss in greater detail in the next few slides. Currently, we recognize more than 1,400 standards with an average increase of about 5 to 10% per year. We did an internal standards utilization study a few years ago, and that showed that an average of 7 standards are cited in each 510K submission. Now, finally, let's talk about conformity assessment very briefly. Once standards are recognized, then what? Well, we need to put the standards to work, which leads to another important component of our total standards life cycle, conformity assessment. A key priority of our conformity assessment work is to promote the use of declarations of conformity in device submissions. And we started our Asca pilot program to help with this initiative. We'll talk more about the Asca pilot shortly, but the goals of the pilot are to enhance confidence in medical device testing, promote consistency and predictability in pre-market review, encourage effective use of FDA resources, and to support international harmonization. So I promised you more information on our recognition program, so here we go. As I mentioned on the previous slide, recognition is FDA's formal identification of a standard to which it's appropriate for manufacturers to declare conformance in order to satisfy a pre-market review requirement. Now, our standards recognition program is a central part of what we do, and we run the recognition program like an SDO runs standards development in an open, inclusive, and transparent manner. Why do we recognize certain standards in the first place? Well, it signals to product developers that FDA considers the standard to be appropriate for use. If a manufacturer elects to conform to one or more recognized standards to meet a pre-market review requirement, they can then submit a declaration of conformity in their submission, which will likely reduce the amount of documentation that would be required. This will help streamline the conformity assessment elements of the device review. We'll talk more about declarations of conformity in a bit, but I just wanted to introduce them and their advantages here. Now, before I go on to how FDA staff approach recognition decision-making, note that we could recognize all or only part of a standard. And since we're committed to transparency, we publish our reasoning or our rationale for each decision. These decisions can be found in our recognized consensus standards database, which is available to everyone. And there is also a database for standards that we specifically choose not to recognize. And finally, we keep an eye on standards and revisions through the standards development work that I talked about on the previous slide. That way, we know when to update our recognition database or even to withdraw standards that are no longer suitable for recognition. Here's how the recognition decision-making process proceeds. First, someone submits a request for a recognition. Now, this can be anyone inside or outside of FDA, and the vast majority do come from our liaisons who work on standards development within FDA. We acknowledge the request with a formal communication. We then convene the appropriate specialty task group, which is that group of experts that I mentioned before, to formally review the standard and make a recommendation to SCAP. SCAP then decides whether to recognize the standard or not. And if we do wish to recognize it, we'll state the extent of our recognition. In other words, is our decision to recognize the complete standard or only part of the standard? And finally, we will add the standard to the recognized consensus standards database when the next update is published, typically twice per year, and will include the scientific, technical, regulatory, or other basis for our decision. This is a screenshot of our database, and you can see that it's searchable using several different criteria, such as standards organization, which is the SDO, the designation number, a recognition number, which is assigned to each standard that we recognize, title or keywords, etc. It's relatively easy to navigate. Now you may be wondering, oh, did I skip it? Okay, sorry. You may be wondering what kind of information is maintained in the database. Well, for every standard that we recognize, we publish a supplementary information sheet, or an SIS, containing the types of information listed here on this slide. I won't read all of the elements listed here, but this type of detailed information is designed as a tool for manufacturers to use and cite a recognized standard. Here we have an example SIS. This one is for ISO 4823, a dental standard. It includes the extent of recognition, the rationale, applicable product codes, etc. Now, next, we'd like to share how standards are used in device submissions to the FDA. I really want to emphasize how strongly FDA encourages manufacturers to cite recognized standards in their device submissions. So much of what we do in SCAP is directed towards making it easy to use standards. When an FDA recognized standard is cited in a DOC, less information and less documentation are needed. And this reduces the burden on both the device manufacturers who are compiling the submission, as well as the FDA staff who review the submission. It just makes it easier for everyone. That said, the use of consensus standards is voluntary. FDA strongly recommends it for all the reasons we just talked about, but their use by a manufacturer is voluntary unless a standard is incorporated by reference into a regulation. And that's a pretty rare thing for a medical device. If a manufacturer wishes to demonstrate conformity to expectations in other ways, that is their prerogative. They just will need to justify their alternative approach. Now, standards may be cited in any type of submission, such as a PMA or 510K. And as mentioned previously, if a standard is recognized by FDA, a declaration of conformity may be used. But general use of a standard is also an option. Just keep in mind that additional documentation will be needed. And we'll talk more about general use of standards in a moment. So what is a declaration of conformity? A declaration of conformity is an attestation from the submitter that the device conforms to all of the requirements of a standard. It confirms to FDA that all normative requirements have been met, all testing has been conducted, and those tests were performed on a finished device. If the submitter is declaring conformity to an FDA-recognized standard, a declaration of conformity should be included in the pre-market submission. And as we said, using a declaration of conformity will reduce the amount of supplemental documentation needed. Now, we'll talk more about what we mean by supplemental documentation in a moment. FDA wants to encourage the use of declarations of conformity. So we wrote a guidance in 2018 explaining exactly what a declaration of conformity should contain. This guidance is called the Appropriate Use of Voluntary Consensus Standards in Pre-Market Submissions for Medical Devices. Since SCAP also prioritizes a reliance upon international consensus standards whenever possible, the appropriate use guidance builds upon ISO IEC 17050-1. Both of these documents are cited at the bottom of the slide. The appropriate use guidance stipulates the following elements for a DOC: the sponsor's contact information, the device's identifying information, the actual statement of conformity, and all of the standards being cited, and you must be sure to include the FDA recognition number for each standard. Other elements are included in the next slide. So those other components of the Declaration of Conformity are the date and place where the declaration was issued, the signature of the responsible party, and any limitations on the validity of the declaration, and finally, any supplemental documentation supporting the Declaration of Conformity. Now, before we turn to a discussion of when and what types of supplemental documentation may be needed, recall that the use of recognized standards and the submission of a DOC is voluntary. That means that manufacturers may also use other non-recognized consensus standards under the general use provision, as well as they may use a recognized standard without a declaration of conformity. However, since declarations of conformity are not included in those cases, complete test reports should be included as part of the submission. These reports will require review by FDA, which adds time to the review process. One other case to mention here is that for more complex standards, like product-specific standards, modifications might sometimes be needed to the test methodology for your particular product. And this is another case where complete test reports for those aspects of the standard may be needed, although declarations of conformity could still be used for the rest of the standard. You can see here that it's pretty clear when supplemental documentation will be needed. When neither test methods nor acceptance criteria are called out in the standard, or when a manufacturer has deviated from the standard. In these cases, FDA will want to see the complete test reports. And if a manufacturer decides to cite a non-recognized standard under general use, even more documentation will typically be needed. Now, this table is taken from the appropriate use guidance, which I mentioned earlier, and it summarizes when and what sorts of supplemental documentation are needed. So we will walk through the different scenarios outlined in this table. The first line of the table points out that standards specifying design requirements do not need to be accompanied by supplemental documentation. As you can see in the yellow box, sometimes a standard includes a test method, but no acceptance criteria. And in those cases, the complete test report is not needed, but supplemental documentation should reference the criteria that the manufacturer tested to. Now, below that line, outlined in blue, is the opposite case. The standard may feature acceptance criteria, but it doesn't specify a test method. As in the previous case, a complete test report is not needed, but manufacturers should submit supplemental documentation about the test methods they chose and why they chose them. As you can see in the green box, when both test methods and acceptance criteria are called out in the standard and the manufacturers use and apply them as written, FDA doesn't need any supplemental documentation. This is really the best case scenario, as it can save both the manufacturers and FDA time. One caveat is that sometimes standards offer choices in the test methods. And when that's the case, the manufacturer should let FDA know which method they chose and why with their supplemental documentation. Now, the final line in the table outlined in red is our worst case scenario. Neither test methods nor acceptance criteria are included in the standard. And for those standards, manufacturers need to submit the complete test reports. At this time, we plan to have a short break. Isa, can you tell us what time our participants should return to the webinar?
Yes, thank you so much, Donna and Scott. At this point, we will allow a 5-minute break. So I will ask all the participants to come back in 5 minutes or so. Thank you. Okay, I hope everyone had a chance to take a quick break. We will resume in about 30 seconds or so. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Before handing it over back to Scott, I would just like to remind everyone we are going to have a question and answer session at the end. There's going to be plenty of time for that. I encourage everyone to put questions in the question and answer box in Zoom. It can be in Spanish, Portuguese, or in English. We have translation. This is really an opportunity to engage with the speakers and utilize their expertise. So I invite people to go ahead and put questions at any time, but we will be reading them at the end of the session. With that, next, I'll hand it over to Scott, who will be talking about the accreditation scheme for conformity assessment, or Asca program, putting the standards to work in conformity assessment. Thank you, Scott, and you're welcome to proceed.
All right, thank you, Vesa, and thank you for introducing the topic here for the accreditation scheme for conformity assessment, or Asca, and in some cases that leads to ask a lot of questions. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why we did this. Go ahead and advance the slide, and I'll describe a little bit about what Asca is. And the Asca pilot was developed with input from experts across the medical device manufacturing and conformity assessment communities. It is a voluntary program, and it leverages a well-established international conformity assessment infrastructure. And it capitalizes on the use of voluntary consensus standards in device development and review. We are putting standards to work in Asca on both the individual submission level as well as on the international level. So why Asca? And before I go into this, I was thinking about, why did FDA get involved with conformity assessment in a way that we hadn't done before? And I was thinking about, all the areas that we know conformity assessment exists, but I don't think we quite appreciate what that means in terms of the rigor and how that applies to the potential for quality and in the competence of where we're going. And I was looking at the back of one of my power sources for my computer that I'm holding up here. And on it, it has lots of little markings, CE and UL and TUV and CCC. And all these were things that, I don't know, just thought were markings over the years when I was younger. But then started realizing that, there was an importance to those areas. And it's not just on electrical devices, it's also on our plumbing pipes. If you go to a hardware, you'll see maybe an ASTM on one of the plastic pipes or copper pipes. If you're in a pub in the UK, you'll pick up the glass of beer you're having and you'll see a CE mark on it. And that's for a specific measurement and also in the strength of the glass. And why is that important is what we started thinking about as regulators, because we were asking questions of manufacturers to how they were testing standards and how they were delivering information to us and how we were seeing information in many different ways. And anytime you see something in an inconsistent fashion, you end up looking more at it and you tend to ask questions, which only slows down the final result of what you're trying to get to, which is to get a product of high quality into the market to help with patient safety. And so we looked at conformity assessment from a different aspect to try to understand what is this community and why is it important? We know that there's testing houses and we knew that there was accredited labs and accreditation bodies, but we never really understood as regulators, nor did manufacturers understand how were they being assessed to determine whether or not they in fact are consistently applying the test methods that are contained in the standards that we recognize. And so we embarked on this process to increase our confidence in these methods and results that we see in device submissions by engaging with new stakeholders in the conformity assessment community. And an enhanced confidence means that manufacturers should usually see fewer requests from additional information coming from us regarding how these methods are going. And this in turn has helped us lead into review processes that are more consistent, predictable, and efficient, which supports our commitment to least burdensome approaches in what we do as regulators. So Asca, most importantly, also should help the patients we all serve to have the access to effective and safe, high-quality devices first in the world, which is one of our major slogans that we really push for. And we believe that getting more involved in understanding how to help the conformity assessment world utilize our standards and how to help manufacturers engage with conformity assessment entities will only improve the quality of our products and submissions and the processes that we have. So let me advance into how Asca works in the next slide. I'm not going to go into great detail, but there is a process to all of this, and it goes like this. We work with accreditation bodies to which, if they can demonstrate that they meet our qualifications or our specifications as outlined in our guidance, which is voluntary, we will grant them what's called Asca recognition. And that means that they have been working with us and they have demonstrated that they understand how to train their employees, their technical assessors, to the specific standards that we have included in this pilot right now. And I'll talk about those a little later. Second, testing labs who have been accredited by the accreditation bodies that are in the program may apply to FDA for what's called Asca Accreditation. Both independent and in-house testing labs may participate, which means a manufacturer's own testing lab could become accredited, and many of them are, and they could apply to this program, as well as a third-party testing lab, say like an Underwriters Laboratory or TÜV Süd or many others that are across the industry. Lastly, or third, the device manufacturer select an Asca accredited lab and can develop the testing plan with them and go through that process of conducting the testing to be able to submit a summary test report to the FDA through the manufacturer. The manufacturer still receives a complete test report because that is necessary for them to understand how their product is functioning and to make sure they have the depth knowledge. But the output of this is that we are hoping to no longer see these complete test reports, and we can, because we have confidence in the competence of testing through our engagement with the testing labs that are engaged in this, be able to see a much smaller version of the amount of information necessary to demonstrate that someone has met the qualifications for a declaration of conformity through a summary test report. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the standards that are included in this. And first, let's talk about biocompatibility. Biocompatibility, as we know, is a very rigorous and very in-depth process of looking at the safety of materials, depending upon the intended use and the contact type and duration of a material with the end user. Could be a clinician, could be the patient. We looked at a specific set of standards that seem to be common to many types of products and thought, let's pilot these areas of standards. And it just so happens that currently, these are the types of test methods that we typically look for in any product that has contact with a patient for 24 hours or less. So it worked very nicely in a way that we can capture how we can improve the concept of engaging with testing laboratories and their ability to ask us questions on, are they testing this the right way in accordance with how their procedures are written, how the qualifications of their own staff are done. We can work with the accreditation bodies in the same way as well to ensure that they're giving consistent approaches to these areas. And the proof is in the pudding. This is still a pilot, and we're working in the forward-leaning process in hopes that this will achieve what we're looking for. But we do believe we have something moving in this area, and we are looking forward to seeing where the outcomes have. So in this slide, you'll see that we have our consensus standards that are recognized in the left side, and then which specific methods from those standards are we specifically focusing on for Asca on the right. Next slide. The second set of standards that we have here is really a large family of standards. So while you see two entries here, that really represents over 80 some standards. The basic safety and essential performance standards in the ASCA pilot are coming from the main families of the 60601 family, which we have the base standard recognized under ANSI/AAMI ES 60601-1. But then there's also about 8 or 10 collateral standards and many dozen particular standards or product-specific standards. We also included the IEC 61010 standard, which is a very different standard from 60601 family, but still has the basic principles of what is looked at by an accreditation body and a testing laboratory to determine the competence of a testing laboratory. And because it really is more focused on the in vitro diagnostic areas, we wanted to include it to help expand the breadth of knowledge and also expand our ability to see, can we bring benefits to the many different areas that we regulate. So let's move on to the next list, or the next slide, the ASCA pilot guidances. So we've developed this pilot under guidance. Many conformity assessment platforms are actually done through rulemaking, but we wanted to do this under guidance to ensure we have the flexibility and the bit to modify it as needed, and to really understand from our stakeholders, whether it be the testing conformity assessment community, the manufacturers, or the standards developers themselves, to make sure we're going through this in the right way, and we are all getting out of it what we're hoping in doing this. We used the guidance process to establish ASCA, and in it, the 3 guidance documents that you see listed above. The first is our program guidance with general information about the pilot and how to participate. What are the general requirements for each of the stakeholders who are engaging in this, whether it's the accreditation bodies, the testing laboratories, the manufacturers who are utilizing those labs to generate the summary test reports and the declaration of conformity, and also the review staff and how we would go about utilizing this to help improve and provide efficiencies and increase our confidence in the competence of testing that is going into this. The other 2 guidance documents outline the specifications for the 2 standards families that I just showed you, and that is the biocompatibility and basic safety and essential performance. Next slide. So in part of what those standard specific guidances, I'll go into a little bit later, the main pilot guidance document really talks about what's necessary from the manufacturer standpoint to show FDA that you are utilizing this program, and this will kick off the pathway in which one would be able to demonstrate how they're using standards through the very important process that Donna talked about, and encouraging the use of declarations of conformity. So really, we're here hoping to simplify that conformity assessment aspects of device review, and we're asking for 3 elements to be included in the submission when ASCA is being used: a cover letter, a declaration of conformity, and the ASCA summary test reports. And we're going to review each of these in turn. So let's start with the pre-market submission cover letter. We encourage the inclusion of a cover letter because this is where you're going to identify to us that the submission is actually including testing from an Asca accredited testing laboratory. And that helps us set up our expectations as a reviewer as to what type of review would I be looking for those elements. Next is the declaration of conformity. And yes, while declarations of conformity are voluntary, in order for us to accept an Asca summary test report, it has to be initiated through a declaration of conformity to a recognized standard included in the pilot. And it should reflect the test lab's Asca accreditation status at the time of testing. And you can check out the examples of declarations of conformity in the 2 standard specific guidances that we have outlined. But we also encourage you to consult with ISO IEC 17050-1 if you're a manufacturer, and Donna discussed that earlier in her discussion. The third and final element is the Asca summary test report provided by the testing lab. And there's examples of those in each of the product specific guidances I mentioned earlier. And these 3 elements are correctly, when these 3 elements are correctly completed and submitted to the FDA, our job is to really not to intend to review those complete test reports and not ask questions on how something was tested, but rely upon the endpoints of the testing to help us determine the ability for that device to match what you are saying it does in its intended use and performance, and that it would support patient safety and the aspects of which these testing reports are important towards. Next slide. So I'm going to shift now into how we participate in the standards and why we participate, and also how we engage from an international. Before I do that, and to kind of close out the Asca discussion or why we're involved in conformity assessment, I think most of us as regulators and manufacturers realize that there is other areas of or subparts of our industry that we rely on. And we have seen successes in doing that in other programs in the past, such as the Medical Device Single Audit Program, or MDSAP, where regulators are working with third parties to help establish, how evaluations to quality systems are being made. There's other areas as well where we rely on third parties to help us in our quest for how we regulate medical devices. And it just made sense that we engage with the many, many hundreds of different types of testing houses that manufacturers rely on in testing their products. And building that relationship with them, we found was the best answer for us to ask less questions of the manufacturers, but help testing houses understand what is it that we're looking for in a test report. And part of what we were looking for didn't come from just FDA, but also in our engagement with other regulators from around the world, because one of our commitments is to ensure that what we are doing here positively impacts the ability for a manufacturer to also operate in another jurisdiction and get their product included into that, using the same types of testing, test reports, and use of standards. There's no point in having a product that needs to be tested 14 different ways just to demonstrate that it's not too hot to the touch, for example. So using standards and using the same standard is important, but using the same standard in the same way is even more important. And that's why engaging with conformity assessment became an extremely important part of our quest to try to reduce burden and improve efficiencies, but most importantly, increase our confidence in that testing is being done of the highest quality, and being able to help promote that as part of our job as a regulatory authority. So now let's talk a little bit about the participation in standards, and we'll move to the next slide. So this slide here is a snapshot from the IMDRF, and it shows the membership of IMDRF in terms of its management committee members, its regional harmonization initiatives, and other official observers. And it's because we've talked a lot about the importance of standards being written to address regulatory needs. The single best way to improve the quality of standards is for regulators to be a part of that team to help write them. After all, even the most robust standards recognition programs have little value if the consensus standards are not suitable for the regulatory use. So to help us understand why and how to contribute to standards development, I'd like to introduce you to the work from the IMDRF, or the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. And this organization, again, is composed of 10 regulatory authority members from groups like the EU, from Brazil, from Asia, from Australia, Northern America, etc. And we also have several very large regional harmonization parties that we engage with, and other organizations such as WHO. These are important alliances to create to help drive common principles and understanding, both in how do we do what we do as regulators, but also how can we speak to our stakeholders and how to help bring common principles of understanding and approaches to improve the ability to get to that harmonization that is the bedrock principle from a global industry. Here is a listing of the IMDrf goals, and the overarching goal of IMDrf is to include, as I mentioned, harmonization among regulators around the world. And by doing so, IMDrf will help address common public health regulatory challenges, and it will also spur innovation by providing a level regulatory playing field for product developers. Next slide. This is a list of current active working groups in the IMDrf right now. And these working groups publish a variety of helpful documents and tools, and we encourage you to visit their website to find them if you're not already familiar with them. And I want to note that our previous standards working group isn't on that list. It was a working group that was very active for a number of years, but its work had been completed. And Imdrf operates where if you're active and you're actively working on something, you're a current working group. If you have completed that work, you become inactive. And that's very similar to how many standard development organizations work. But I want to speak a little bit about what we did. And while the working group is inactive, the role of what we developed has just begun. So next slide. So recognizing the importance of consensus standards to the harmonization process, the Imdrf Standards Working Group conducted surveys and other research to learn about how regulators use standards and about how we can improve how standards are used. Among other findings, Imdrf concluded that relatively poor levels of participation by regulators tend to result in standards that are not fit for regulatory use. On what manufacturers are trying to do to convey to regulators. Another issue, though, was the negative impact that an unbalanced representation can have in the content of standards. Ideally, consensus standards should be written by individuals who have expertise and an interest in the substantive use of a standard. This means that in addition to industry, clinicians, engineers, regulatory experts, and others should be a part of the conversation. If standards are written too flexibly or without minimum requirements for performance and safety of the device, they won't be suitable for their use in regulatory settings. And it's only when we bring in all of our stakeholders, including those who are impacted by the devices that are developed, our clinicians and patients, and the academia that are challenging the production of new technologies and to help improve the ecosystem of our technology industry, we bring them all together, we have the ability to then have a standard that can help drive that initiative. But we want to make sure that we understand that each stakeholder in that group understands what is needed from their perspective to help the appropriate use of that standard. And so we'll talk a little bit here about what we did in that activity that helped develop the optimizing standards for regulatory use. So once the research was complete, Imdrf undertook Fda Guidance. Gail, if you could just go to the slide that says optimizing standards. Oh, you got it, never mind. Once this research was complete, Imdrf undertook the writing of the guidance. As you see here, in 2018, we published the optimizing standards for regulatory use. Why early participation is particularly valuable. The first element of the guidance outlines how standards content can be enhanced. These and those listed in the next slide are recommendations from the guidance. First of all, the standards rationale should, in addition to explaining the general requirements, also identify test methods or other means for a user to demonstrate compliance. The rationale should also have a reference to how the standard helps meet the Imdrf essential principles, for example, which is a set of core tenets for device regulation. The standard should summarize the type of stakeholder groups involved in the drafting and editing of the standard for transparency purposes. They should identify risk and provide direction on how to address that risk. And just to speak a little bit about risk, we know that risk and risk management and the risk analysis that it goes into looking at device design, development, design controls is extremely important in our industry to ensure that we can keep driving new safe technologies into our industry. But it's equally important to ensure that the way we measure risk mitigation and communicate that is in a quantitative way. And it ends to a point where a manufacturer or a test house or whoever the entity is that's communicating downstream in this process understands how to communicate this in a very objective fashion and in a consistent way. And that is one of the bridges that we're hoping to help improve by bringing more regulators to the table so they understand what is needed for them to feel confident in the results that are being demonstrated and in the terms to which they are being presented. If applicable, the standards should also include a means to assess clinical performance. We do have standards that are now addressing clinical performance, patient safety areas, And it's important, if we're going to do that in a standard, that that community is also engaged. Next slide. In addition, standards should feature clear and quantitative acceptance criteria, as I've mentioned many times, and I believe Donna has as well, because that is ideal. And if we can get to that in a standard, it helps communicate to each stakeholder what is expected if you're using that standard, and if you need to deviate from that standard to demonstrate a different types of acceptance criteria, how you could do that. The standard should explain how conformities can be met in the absence of those criteria or with them in both ways. It's important for us to understand how to use the standard appropriately. If acceptance criteria are not mandatory, there should be a justification for why they are not, and of course, a way to show conformance to the standard. Test methods should be well accepted and verified test methods, including for new or unfamiliar methods. Some SDOs actually take the extra step to go through verification and validation of their test methods prior to publication, while others, that is not the main focus. And part of that is due to resources, time, and a number of other things. But we also need to be cognizant of how does a manufacturer utilize these test methods in accordance with how they operate in their own quality system. And we know that in ISO 13485, for example, it is expected that a manufacturer will verify and validate all methods being utilized, and that includes those that are in standards. So we want to make sure that as regulators, we understand that, but we also want to make sure that as manufacturers, they know how to do that. And anywhere where that can be facilitated through the use of the standard or through other tools that the standard may have accompanying it will help assist in that process. For revisions, the changes should be transparent, clear, and easy to navigate using track changes modes, for example, for us to understand the evolution of standards. And in fact, just yesterday, I was having a conversation with an SDO, and last Friday, another one with another international SDO, talking about the importance of how we collect information on how standards would support the need for a revision. In many cases, we rely only on the working group experts and the comments that are received or a vote that was conducted, but we don't necessarily have data. And data is an important element of what we do to try to manage how are we doing currently and where are we going in the future. And part of our standards process is to ask for SDOs to try to work with its members, whether it's internationally or even with national standards, to ensure that we're collecting the appropriate data from the right stakeholders to help measure the impact of the standard and whether that standard should be modified for improvement, modified to catch up with technology, or left alone because it's working just fine. Finally, and ideally, the standard should have an annex or table at the end that cross-references the standards. And we've talked a little bit just earlier about the Imdrf essential principles. And I want to bring that up as an important element because FDA, as a member to Imdrf, does feel that trying to find a way for consensus is done through an organization like Imdrf and through the supporting regional authorities that are built into this organization. And the essential principles has a long history that far dates in front of the Imdrf with the Global Harmonization Task Force of years past. And this is an important step for us to try to pull in what are the important elements that regulators feel are necessitate building the assurance case that a manufacturer makes for their product. And the essential principles were developed to try to bring those common areas for that approach. Standards really want to be found as the pieces of the puzzle to be built into that tool and to try to demonstrate what essential principles and where are those essential principles built into the standard and how their use will help achieve what a manufacturer is trying to do and in communicating to its regulatory authority. Furthermore, when we have a set of common principles like the Imdrf essential principles, regulators can build educational programs for its stakeholders and for itself, and processes that will help drive harmonization tactics to improve globalization of our products and our industry. The next slide. So as mentioned earlier, participation is important. And to increase utilization of standards for regulatory applications, we firmly believe that regulatory authorities need to be engaged and where possible, participate in standards development at both the national and international level. At the international level, regulatory authority engagement is welcomed in various committees, whether it's an ISO, IEC, or other international organizations like ASTM, IEEE, UL, you name it. There is a number of organizations that are seen as international. And regulators are strongly encouraged to serve as experts through their official country delegations or even as experts to other organizations. Equally important is in participation in the mere committees. And as noted above, the national bodies develop consensus on their country's position and votes. Their nominating function to ISO and IEC, for example, when going through a country delegation process, makes national level engagement even more important for regulators. This accessibility at the national level supports consensus principles and is an important feature that facilitates participation in standards development without requiring the membership and resources necessary for ISO and IEC. And so let me explain that from a different context, because I recognize that most regulatory authorities don't have the bandwidth to fully participate in the hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of standards working groups across there. And that even includes FDA. What we do find, though, is that there's a massive advantage in how we are able to enhance our work and lessen our burden if we can find a way to become engaged. And working with your national standards bodies is one of those ways to do that. Both ISO and IEC Central Office is committed to working with national bodies to ensure that stakeholders that include regulators, academia, users, patients can be a part of that process in the least burdensome way possible to ensure that they can bring that function into the standards development cycle. They recognize the importance of us as stakeholders in there, and they want to try to do what's best. And we'll walk through a little bit about how we can do that moving forward. So we have mentioned national bodies and national committees, which are represented to ISO and IEC, and that will be the focus for a lot of what we discuss. But if you're interested in joining other standards organizations that do expert nominations, you can contact them directly as well. If we hope to participate in these groups, we must know how to get engaged. That's what we want to try to help a little bit with today. That process isn't always as clear as we'd like it to be. This and the next few slides will demonstrate how to join this work at the national body level, which is a good place to start. And again, a lot of these principles are built into that guidance document that I showed earlier from Imdrf. These organizations within the Standard Developing Organization member countries develop consensus standards on issues and areas that the Sdos work on. The national bodies, which are known in ISO and national committees through IEC, are often national standards organizations themselves. For example, ANSI is the US representative body in the US, and we have many others that are known across the different countries around the world that are engaged. And they conduct their work under the same consensus principles that are so important to standards development. And that is a critical component and actually a requirement to be a part of that international consortium of consensus standards bodies, is that we all work underneath that same principle of developing consensus. So what do these national bodies do? First, they appoint individuals who will actually sit on these technical committees to represent their country as experts. The national bodies also convene mirror committees to work on the standards to build the national position. Sometimes these are very active groups, sometimes they're more remote. It really depends on the need and also the request of what are the needs of the members of those committees. This includes reviewing documents, coming to an agreement, and commenting on the standards under development. The individuals who have been appointed to these committees then take the national body's position to the technical committee. And in many cases, that's represented to the working groups within a committee. It is very important that regulators participate on both sides of this work, both in the national bodies work, but if possible, at the international SDO level as well. The only way to build standards that are useful for regulatory purposes, when I say that, I mean that through an international sense, is to actually try to be at the table, whether it's in person or at least having your voice clearly understood and where that comment came from when it is discussed at the national body, international level. And that process, that perspective, is integral to standards development. Next slide. So this slide here just shows if you wish to participate, for example, in the IEC committee, you can start by clicking on a link that we've provided in the slide. And it goes into listing the IEC technical committees and subcommittees. And once you arrive to that listing, you scroll down to that committee of interest and click on it. And then you'll see in the structured tab that's circled here in red. Next slide, where you click on the country whose national committee information you seek, we have pulled up Switzerland, for example, and you can find that organization as well as the contact person for that country. Next slide. ISO is a little bit different, though you can start out the same way by visiting the list of technical committees. You can find the committee you're interested in and click on it on that page. And here you see the 4 numbers. The third one over is for the list of participating members. You click on the blue number itself, and then you choose your country at the next page. In our example, you'll see that the contact information for Canada's national standards body. So what happens though if your country isn't involved? What happens if you don't know who your national standards body is? And there are ways that you can get to that part. And this goes to the commitment that the organizations such as ISO and IEC, but also any organization that I know that also work in many countries around the world, like ASTM and UL and so forth. They have ways for you to do this. If your country is not a member and you want to join, and we do encourage that, you may want to write to them at the email addresses you see on the slide. And I'm always myself a little hesitant to email anyone that's just info at whatever the organization is. But I guarantee you, you will get a response from these groups, and they will try to connect you with your national standards body. And also, if they are not a participating member to a particular area of interest, help walk through that with your national standards body to see if there is a need that could be established to help support the engagement into that process. So the next slide is a set of international references, and this includes things from the Imdrf, ISO, IEC. It also includes the directives, which are real important principles of how standards are developed, and other groups such as the Asian Harmonization Working Party Playbook. Slide 2, the next slide also talks about different guides that ISO has for recommended practices of participating in standards. Looking at how to include safety aspects in standards. Organizations such as the Society for Standards Professionals that FDA joined a number of years ago to engage with standard developing organizations and learn how they operate as an industry themselves. And these are great resources to investigate, to become more familiar with if you're interested in getting your group to understand how standards can benefit you in the role in which you are interested. The next slide is some US standards resources. Here we share 4 FDA resources, our webpage for the Standards and Conformity Assessment Program, a link to our Recognized Consensus Standards database, and links to 2 guidances we talked about earlier with the recognition and withdrawal of voluntary consensus standards and the appropriate use of voluntary consensus standards in pre-market submissions for medical devices. And these are great guidances to familiarize how we have utilized the international standards conformity assessment toolbox and basic principles that we feel help with the harmonization of our industry across borders, as well as meeting the needs as a regulator in the United States to achieve what standards are purporting to try to demonstrate in their use. And these are all great resources and really are the foundation building blocks that we have used. The ideas weren't created from FDA in what you will see here. These were created by the consortium of what takes place in standards and conformity assessment, the consortium of regulators from around the world, because one of our commitments is to ensure that how we cite the use of standards appropriately through our program is something that should be able to be shared in other jurisdictions as well. And that's always is one of our challenges to ensure, but it is a commitment that we will continue to embark upon in the years to come. The next slide describes a little bit about our conformity assessment initiative. And again, this is a pilot program right now that is advancing in its maturity. And what I can say is, being involved in standards has been wonderful. We have about 25 years of formal experience of that under our mandate to recognize standards. But the more recent engagement with conformity assessment platforms and engaging with national and international accreditation bodies, national and international testing houses, and bring in those discussions in with our manufacturers and different regulators has really opened our eyes into how can we improve standards, how we can make sure standards are communicating to the right stakeholder in its own life cycle to ensure its appropriate use to meet the regulatory needs, if that is the pathway that that standard is going to need to go through. And so these guidances spell out how we went through this approach, how we took a very broad area like biocompatibility or basic safety and essential performance, and was able to find a way to create a summary test report that distills down the critical elements that are important for us while having confidence in the entire testing process. And that was a really critical objective for us. And we believe we have been able to find something that now we can apply back into the standards development process to further enhance the ability for us to objectively assess conformity assessment and have the ability to educate ourselves as regulators, as well as all the other stakeholders in this process collectively, and improve overall technology uses and communications, so that way we can be along as regulators in that ride and not reactive, but proactive in how we can help drive those technologies and improve patient outcomes. The next slide is just a little bit about additional educational resources. These are resources that we have developed to help educate our own staff as well as our stakeholders. These are constantly being updated because there's always new information, and we either adding into or updating this stuff. But this is a great area for people to learn about the different areas that you can understand how we use standards, but as well, how do we use standards to into different processes, and is a great resource that we're very happy to be able to share with you. And that brings us to the end. Again, I want to thank everyone who has been a part of this, especially Sandra, Katie, and Vesa. Our engagement with this over the years has been very fulfilling for us and educational. And we really do appreciate the effort that put in by the committee here, and working with many of our colleagues over the years, such as ANSI and the many standard developing organizations that have all been supportive of this, including our trade associations like AdvaMed and MITA, MDMA, who have been helping us drive where we can use standards. I hope we can have a really great dialogue here moving into some questions. I'm sure some of you have them, and I know we have a couple to start off if we need to. And I just again want to thank you on behalf of myself and Donna. And I think Vesa will turn it over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott and Donna, for really great presentations and for providing, in addition, some great resources, as well as explaining how others can participate in standards as well. Really good information there. We do have, I see some handful of questions that already have come in. At this point, I also would invite my colleague, Patty Pineda, to join as well and help us with some of the questions that have come in Spanish. Thank you, Patty, for making yourself available. I think what we will do is, we will go in order of the questions as we have received. And again, there is a question and answered box in Zoom. Everyone has the availability to, just put the questions there. Again, we have some good time, and it's an opportunity for everyone to ask those questions. Also, there's an ability to, to be anonymous if you don't feel, sharing your name. So that is also available. With that, I think maybe we'll start with the first question. Patty, do you mind reading the first one? Thank you.
Thank you. So the first question is from Clarena Cruz, and she says, thank you. From INVIMA, Colombia, I would like to know if the declaration of conformity can be a document written by the manufacturer and included in the pre-market submission process.
Yes, the document can be written by the manufacturer and should be included. Scott, do you have anything to add? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, no, I'd just add to that. Yes, in fact, the declaration conformity is something that is of the responsibility of, it's called a supplier's declaration conformity in ISO IC 17050. But the supplier in this case is intended to be from the manufacturer itself. It is their attestation that the information in the standard or standards that the declaration conformity is written towards demonstrates that they have met the requirements of that standard. And the second element of that is, and is evidenced by the supplemental documentation, if that standard necessitates the need to provide that. So the short answer is yes, it is of the manufacturer, and it would be included in their submission. And I believe the submission contents show how that can be added in.
Okay, thank you. So the next one is the ISO 14971 was updated in 2019. One of the new requirements is cybersecurity. Is there an extension from the FDA to update the approved dossier or submission, or to submit new information to update the risk management plan or report?
Donna's going to make me take this one. So
Yeah.
First, I will admit I am not a cybersecurity expert, but I am aware that ISO 14971, when updated in 2019, and I believe is recognized now by FDA, includes an element of how do you bring cybersecurity into your risk and risk management file. How does, and as I mentioned earlier, 13485 even uses the risk management process of 14971. And while it hasn't updated this version of the standard, one of its purposes of being included was to try to help establish how do you assess risk manage cybersecurity risk. And using the principles of 14971 as part of your responsibility under your quality system is the tool, one tool that could be done. So what are FDA's expectations? Well, I don't want to give the standard government answer, but it does depend. It depends. It depends on what products are we talking about? How are you utilizing 14971 in the discussion of your submission? Does your product have cybersecurity risks? If so, how did you outline that in the risk analysis? What process did you use to identify the risks? What was the mitigating step? Maybe utilizing a set of standards, or maybe some principles or a guidance or other aspects that are important. So if you're trying to demonstrate or communicate how you have assessed the cybersecurity risk, then I would encourage manufacturers to ensure that they find out how that was included into 14971. This is a very new area, of course, for regulators, not just FDA, but across the US that are trying to help figure that out. The important thing is that you're talking about it and going through that appropriate process of demonstrating the likelihood of occurrence, the severity of that occurrence, and then what did you do to mitigate those risks, introspective of how this new emerging area is coming about.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Clarena Cruz also, and she's asking, how could the regulation encourage the manufacturers to comply with the standards and see them as a benefit and not as a technical barrier to trade?
So the first area that I would want to speak to, if we look at what the standards program operates under, to which areas in the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, and we operate under the section 514C, which says FDA shall recognize a standard to which a manufacturer may, the voluntary aspect, submit a declaration of conformity to support the content of what that standard is designed to do. The design of using a standard is to try to ensure that, our goal is to try to recognize the standard for how it was published and to encourage its appropriate use. So it's being communicated to us to help assist taking that information and making a regulatory determination. In the appropriate use guidance, the principles that are developed to understand how to use a standard, as well as how to, as a regulator, reflect our assessment of a standard, is designed to support trade, is designed to support international aspects of standards, since majority, if not all standards that we recognize, even the ones that come through our national bodies, are used in dozens and dozens of countries. So standards use, and in fact, is a supporter of trade. It is a supporter of encouraging harmonization. And it would be where we are not accepting the use of a standard that the converse could apply more so, when we would say we don't agree with this standard, and we don't provide you with any rationale, and we don't provide you with an alternative solution, that becomes more of a barrier, because you need to find a different way to communicate that topic to us. And that is an area that we know exists. There are standards that we don't recognize, and we are required also, and this was updated in 21st Century Cures Act, that we are required to provide a justification as to why a particular standard would not be accepted in a declaration of conformity, which doesn't mean you can't use the standard. It's just that we would need to see more documentation to support its use. And that goes to the general use provision of our standard, where we can use a standard either that is recognized, but maybe you had to modify it. It was recognized, but you still feel you need to provide the full test report based on the design of the standard or just what you feel is important. Or the standard isn't recognized. And maybe even is said by FDA is not recognized, but you could still use the general use provision to describe its use by providing a complete test report. And our goal there is to still permit standards to be used. It's just that you may need to provide some additional information that goes beyond that standard to satisfy the topic that standard goes into. One example is the transition that we had about 10 years ago from the second edition of 60601, which is the basic safety essential performance standard, to the third edition. And when we transitioned to the third edition, the second edition eventually transitioned out. But in some cases, even in the US, was still being utilized for areas like the worker safety provisions that OSHA regulates under. The problem was that the second edition advanced itself by incorporating risk management and started talking more about the environments, the users, the patient safety aspects, rather than just some of the performance and safety aspects of how the device functions. It was much more broad and was something that was driven towards regulators. So we needed to figure that out. It took 10 years for the regulators to figure out how to deal with risk management and how to figure that out in a declaration of conformity. But once we did, the second edition was no longer seen as an acceptable standard to support a declaration of conformity, because if we continue to accept declarations of conformity to both, the manufacturers that use the second edition won't address, or may forget to address, the other aspects that the risk management approach in the third edition extends. And that's the extension of how the devices support the patient and the user and in its environment, and how to bring in other areas such as usability and the expansion that did. So there's a reason why we transition into new standards and why they become important, and why sometimes a standard needs to be described. Very complex question, very complex answer. But the long story short is that we try to make sure we utilize standards to support the trade agreements that we're working on. And if we need questions to help support driving those forward, we are happy to keep taking that and working with our colleagues.
Thank you very much for that answer, Scott. I will read the next question. It says the DOC issued by European manufacturers follows the format according to the EU legislation, which omits information requested by FDA. Is there recognition to the EU format?
So that's another very good question. The short answer is not quite. So there are certain elements that we are asking for in the declaration of conformity that helps us understand how to utilize that standard in our pre-market review. And that includes the version of the standard, which goes to our recognition number, for example. The EU doesn't have our recognition numbers. They have their own numbers that come through the standardization request process and all those other aspects that the EU facilitates. So they are a little bit different. This is an area I think that regulators could work together to try to harmonize on. It is a struggle, but realize that the declaration of conformity element that was shown in Donna's presentation has two parts. And it did follow the ISO IEC 17050 series. And part one is just those elements of the declaration. You know, who's the manufacturer, who is the testing lab, what was the standard, what, you know, what's its recognition, and then signed by Joe responsible from that organization. The second element is the meat and potatoes of the declaration of conformity, and that's usually where the supporting documentation comes from. In many cases, like say in the IEC world, that could be a testing form, you know, that is, you know, common through the ICEE and is utilized to support the CE marking and goes through the notified bodies process that Europe uses. We accept those in our declaration of conformity, but we also, as shown in our Asca pilot, are interested in not seeing those hundreds of pages of documentation. If you are utilizing a lab that we have a relationship with and have the confidence in their competence to test, we want a smaller amount of information. And that's where the summary test report is an option. And that is another way that one could go through. We have many labs in Europe and in Asia. I think we have a few in Latin America now that are a part of this pilot. And our goal is to really, first and foremost, just figure out how can we make sure we have confidence in the competence of testing to share with our review staff, but also to help make this a worthwhile effort for all stakeholders. Can we minimize the amount of information that's necessary to make a regulatory determination? It doesn't change the amount of information manufacturer needs as they're assessing their document and supporting their quality system and looking at change management and all those real important principles. But the way we set up our declaration of conformity was designed to follow least burdensome principles and trying to minimize the impact that regulators and industry members need in how we communicate where standards fit into that pipeline.
Thank you very much, Scott. Just a follow-up question to that. How many labs are accredited as part of the pilot, did you say?
Currently, we have 77 labs.
Oh, okay.
I think it might be more next week, but the downside is we have very few in the biocompatibility space. We have many that we are currently working with. But biocompatibility is a different world than it is in the IEC standards, where those organizations actually have consortiums that work together, do interlaboratory studies with each other. A very different culture versus biocompatibility labs, which are a little bit more siloed, have their own test reports individually. They're all very different, have different protocols to the methods that are all a little bit different and end up in differences in how the results are displayed. Whereas in the IEC, we have the CB scheme. We have, like I said, the test report forms that they use through that process, and those groups work together. And that's where we had to that was part of our charge, is to figure out the different cultures of conformity assessment to do that. But yeah, it's a great question. So we have a pretty good list of labs. It continues to grow, and we're trying to figure out how to engage that with our stakeholders to see the value proposition for everyone. And but it's proven to be very valuable in our understanding of how this world works.
Yeah, very interesting. I think that that answer kind of is a good segue to this other question that came in. So it says for materials that have been used for many years, a full set of biocompatibility is omitted. Is a safety historical justification acceptable?
Sure. Do you want to take that down, or you want me to?
Well, I would think that as long as if they're doing their biocompatibility testing to some recognized standards where you know, those are tried and true test methods, they could put that in the Declaration of Conformity, and they wouldn't need to submit too much more information depending on what's in the standards. You know, if you have to choose a test method. But Scott may want to add some more.
What I can do is I'll expand on that. And it's not a it depends answer really. From our standpoint, it really depends upon, has this material that as you have used been tested to the same contact type and duration within the same device that has a similar intended use. Processing of the device, further processing it, whether it's sterilization, is important. So if that material was tested for biocompatibility under radiation sterilization, is now being utilized in a device with ethylene oxide as a sterilization method, that may change the principles of the material and how it reacts with the human body. And that would require that it would be tested again to the biocompatibility standards. But if the processing is identical, if the type of device in which the material is being utilized is very similar, then yes, the historical safety data that was used should be able to be utilized. But we do have guidance on this specific area as well that helps provide manufacturers two different areas. There's a guidance on when do I submit a new device based upon a change. And one of those change discussions is materials or other processes like sterilization, or our biocompatibility guidance, which goes into very far depth on what types of testing is needed and what types of information is necessary to support that. And I think one of those areas is discussed as well.
Yeah, so in other words, not just the material, but also we take into consideration manufacturing and processing.
Very much. In fact, that is as important, and that is in many cases the deciding factor that goes into that ability. And it also includes additive manufacturing, because additive manufacturing kind of flipped biocompatibility upside down. What is the printer that's being used? What's the control factors around it? And so there's a lot of new information when people are looking into those areas, which became very important in COVID when we're using 3D printing for so many new areas to support the initiatives that we have.
Yeah, very good points. Thank you. The other question is, one of the requirements of the DOC is the identity of the product. Does this item include a generic nomenclature like GMDN or UMDNS?
I'm happy to take that down if you want. Our intention was to not try to get too deep into those factors. What we are looking for is, how did you identify the product in terms of how you would put it into your own cover letter? How would you want us to identify that product in our clearance or approval letter? In many cases, it's the model, it's the type, it's those types of aspects that identify the product code and CFR regulation that it falls underneath. There are other ways that you're going to show your GMDN, your UDI numbers, those other elements that are important. It doesn't have to be in the Declaration of Conformity for sure.
Thank you. This other question says, as there's always a struggle regarding resources availability both for regulators and the industry, can you share how did you manage to make them available to participate in the technical committees of the SDOs?
So I can take that. So we have a process internally where we, once we determine that there's a need for an FDA participant in a particular committee or working group, we utilize our specialty task groups and we prioritize the activity. So once it's determined that there is a need and we do need someone to participate, we have an internal advertisement process where we seek qualified candidates. And part of that process is that anyone who applies needs to have their supervisory concurrence so that there is a clear there's clear support that they do have the bandwidth to cover those additional responsibilities. Scott, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important question, and I recognize that every organization has a different level of bandwidth and resources that they can put into this, which is what we also brought into consideration when we worked in IMDRF to help this, because the different members, many of them didn't have the type of resources that we have. And nor do I think that's necessary to be an active participant in standards as well. I think you have to find out why is standards important to you? Not just what is a standard and how is it used, but why is that important? And in many cases, you might find that being involved in standards at some level through some mechanism may provide great value to how you operate as an organization, whether it's a manufacturer themselves or a regulatory body. And that is to Donna's point, part of the element of what we do when we evaluate being engaged in certain standards. There are many standards working groups that we do not actively participate in, but we observe. There are some where we just let them do their thing because we just don't have that bandwidth to get into. And then there's others that are so important to us that we would even want to be in the leadership of that committee if possible, meaning to be a chair of a technical committee or a convener or a project lead. And that, because it's so important, we want to be able to be involved in developing the consensus at that national or international level. The other side of this is we recognize that it is hard to publish important, very robust documents as a regulatory authority in the United States. And I'm sure that's very similar around the world. We are very active in writing standards drafts, new work item proposals, and submitting them to the Sdos to help carry that workload for us in developing it in that type of environment, and then utilizing those standards. So areas like cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, as well as material safety and risk management, are areas that we have written new work item proposals to develop an update to an existing standard or to develop a new standard in an area that we believe helps do what we do and helps industry in their quest to getting into the market. We've done this individually ourselves, and we've done this in collaboration with stakeholders such as trade associations or other regulators from around the world as well. And what we have found is the effort to produce a standard is far less than the effort to write a rule or a guidance document. And it's not just like a 2-to-1, it's almost like a 10-to-1 difference in the number of effort to develop a document as robust as what a standard could be in comparison to a guidance document that requires 10 or 12 people to work on that. And so once you start getting involved with that process, you start finding how it actually lowers your burden and it expands the ability for you to have more resources to do other things. And this is I could give a whole course on this, but it is something that I'd be happy to talk more with individuals in the future about how do we navigate that and how do you build that up. We work with a lot of different regulatory authorities from around the world on that question, and it's an important one to try to think about.
Thank you, Scott and Donna. I think, Donna, you explained that there is an internal process for call out for staff to participate when there is a need. I believe there's a lot of the participants are those reviewers that do the submission reviews for medical devices prior for clearance or authorization. And maybe you can elaborate a little bit on because it seems like there is a normal role that they have, but also then they participate in standards as well. It's not that we have specific people that only do standard development. And maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that. And how do you think why do you think that is so important for the staff to be involved as part of this process? So that's a question.
That's a great question, and you're absolutely right. They do have their ordinary role, which for many of our standards liaisons is the role of a reviewer of those medical device applications. So we feel that it is very important for them to get involved in the standards because standards are used so much in the submissions that they receive and they review, and it just is very helpful for the whole review team if the people reviewing the standards are familiar and more importantly, that the standards that are being cited have gotten that buy-in by FDA, whether it's by participating at the ground level or through recognition. So it is something they, a lot of times we say it's like, it's not their first priority. Standards sometimes gets, pushed. It's work that they have to do maybe after hours. I don't know if Scott wants to comment on that, but we do feel it's really important.
It is. It's what we find also, though, is many of and we have a small army of people involved in standards, literally, but they see it as very important for their own professional development as well. You're sitting around the world with the experts from so many different disciplines and stakeholders that it's extraordinarily valuable. So it's enticing them to want to be involved as well, and it helps them do their job better. As Donna mentioned, sometimes standards work, especially in the COVID environment, is during odd hours. I've had meetings at 3 a.m. and 10 p.m, and I had one just last week that started at 5 a.m. That's part of COVID, but it's all part of what we do as well in supporting our mission. The importance of being at the table goes beyond too just bringing your influence, but to actually understand what went into the standard helps you understand how to use that standard when you come back. When we did that research survey in Imdrf, one of the areas that most regulatory authorities had problems with also coincided with them not being at the table was understanding certain principles of how someone demonstrates conformity to the standard. And I'll give you one example. In the 3rd edition of 60601, throughout the document, it says many times, check conformity through inspection of the risk management file. And many regulators go, what do I do with that? What does that mean? That's such a subjective way. They can just come up with anything. But that's because they don't understand how risk analysis and risk management is utilized to begin with, and that the risk analysis would identify what the endpoint would be based upon the mitigation steps that are done to manage risks. And once you start understanding that and read how that was brought into the standard, it makes the standard become more objective, not subjective, which a lot of people feel standards like 60601 became in their 3rd edition. But in fact, they expanded the ability for the technologies to advance and allowed us to still find where an appropriate endpoint can be established to support the overall use of the product. But that was a problem. And I would say 90% of those who had that difficulty understanding, they were also not engaged in the process. And it's important to understand, why being involved in a standard like 60601, for example, is very important to understand how, as an organization like a regulator, you can use those tools to help you do your work and make it a lot easier. And that's just one example.
Thank you. I would like to invite Patty to take this next question. Thanks, Patty.
Thank you. So our next question is from Oscar Marin, and he's asking, how does Asca relates to the mutual agreements recognition signed with other countries?
That's a great question. Right now, it's not formally designated into that pathway for mutual recognitions for clearance. And Asca is a testing standard pilot. It is not a product certification standard like what the EU has with the CE marking, for example. It uses 17025 and not 17065 or the product certification standards. But it's designed to try to get us to lean into international harmonization, in that the first accreditation bodies we have engaged with are members of the ILAC. They're ILAC signatories with mutual recognition agreements with other accreditation bodies. And that allows that the idea is for us to figure out how we can engage with those parties, bring what we feel is necessary to improve the assessment of testing labs competencies, as outlined in an aspect like in our guidance. And then from there, how do we expand that so we could eventually build into where other accreditation bodies can also be a part of this through structures like ILAC. We aren't there yet. It is a pilot, but it is designed for us to help support the underpinnings of what's necessary to get to something you're speaking to. And that is actually something that the IMDRF themselves are also interested in. And that's a single review platform. How do we get mutual recognition where I would accept, a review from Canada or Brazil or Australia to allow for market entry into the United States? And that's through things like mutual recognition agreements. This is the underpinnings, building blocks for us to be confident in how the material being presented and how it's being tested is done, and how can we apply that globally.
Thank you, Scott. The next question says, thank you for sharing all the great work that has been done under IMDRF on standards. Now that FDA is a member of GHWP, are you envisioning to leverage it to the benefit of the party work?
Yeah, boy, someone's really keeping up with the news, because that literally is fresh off the hot pot there. We just joined the Global Harmonization Working Party just a few weeks ago. And Melissa Torres from our International Affairs Office helped work with that initiative. And it was because we really saw the value in being engaged with them. GHWP is an official observer into IMDRF. They utilize several of the documents from the IMDRF, but they also have a little bit more of a broad framework in how they engage with members. There are members from industry and trade associations. It's not just regulators as the primary members, but it's included. And we saw value in that, and we saw value in some of the areas that they are investigating, and also the fact that they have a dedicated technical committee on standards and standards use. And from my perspective, yes, that's where I see us becoming engaged with that type of organization, to see if we can hear from other members from regulatory backgrounds or industry backgrounds and SDO backgrounds to help further the work that has been initiated way back from before IMDRF even, but to help continue what we're doing. So I do see this as a great opportunity in the future. We want to make sure we can benefit where possible, and help bring education into our own regulatory system, as well as bring what we have into that system as well.
Thank you, Scott.
Okay, next question.
Go ahead, Patty.
Next question, it's in practice, how does the standards recognition impact the FDA's regulatory processes? Are these processes more agile? Are requirements waived? Or how is it operated?
Go ahead.
So, okay, I'll take a stab at that. So in our recognition database, as I mentioned, each recognized standard has a supplementary information sheet, or an SIS. And one of the things that's included on that SIS is a list of applicable product codes or regulations and guidances that may be applicable to the product within the scope of that standard. So that's really the first place, if you're interested in using a recognized standard, that's one of the first places that a manufacturer will go to, because it includes all of that extra information that helps them. They can use it as a tool. Oftentimes, the manufacturers will choose to get in touch with the review branch, or the review team that is in charge of reviewing that particular product area, and they can steer them in the direction if other requirements are needed. But yeah, the listing of pro codes is a list of product codes that are applicable. It's not an exhaustive list, but it does point them in the right direction. I'm not sure if that answered the complete question.
I think there's one more element to that, and that does it waive any of the requirements needed? And I would say it doesn't. What standards are is a common communication tool that shows how you've met a particular requirement or specification, or however you want to define it. And here's the process that which, if you use the standard, we understand what that means, and you can demonstrate it through that tool, which should be a least burdensome approach in doing such, and potentially a lot less time needed to review that if the appropriate declaration of conformity is used. But it doesn't waive the requirement of the manufacturer to still need to do that as part of their quality system, their design control process, how they've managed the risk manage, the mitigation steps of what they need to do to demonstrate the safe and effective use of the device. So I would say standards are an extraordinary communication tool, just like how we use guidance documents and even rulemaking. And I would say that approach is what's needed, but it doesn't waive a requirement of a manufacturer, but may lessen the burden on how they communicate that effort to the regulatory body.
Thank you. The next question says, hi, I want to know, what do you think about the waiver proposed by South Africa and India?
No, I'm not too sure what they mean by waiver in the context. Is there a way that could be found, or?
Maybe we'll ask for additional information to put in the question.
One thing, I'll try to speak to what I know about India and what's actively going on, and it's not specific to the medical device space, but there is some legislation being negotiated between the USTR and in India on India's proposal to require for in-country testing, for example. And the fact that all the countries have to be accredited only by the organizations within that country, and in order to import into the country, you have to have been tested from an in-country testing home. So if you were to test in any of our countries and try to, and you do all the right testing in accordance with what they would want, it wouldn't no longer allow you to still get into their country, and it would require you to test in there. Those are the types of activities that are seen as a barrier to trade in the eyes of many manufacturers and many governments. And so there is a lot of discussion about why that is so important. 15 years ago, we were having the same discussion with other countries that also had that, and China was an example. And they have since been addressing that appropriately to try to ensure that they are not being a barrier to trade. So I think part of that is important for us to consider how countries are requesting the use of standards and testing and use of testing houses, and part of it is, does the entity understand how to build confidence around it, and looking into what goes into accreditation, what are those principles of accreditation and assessment. So that's active. I'm not too sure what's meant by the waiver side of things, though, and I don't know if part of that is dealing with, like, say, COVID, and where there are certain products that are waiving the requirement for X, Y, or Z to come into the country. I know certain countries have looked at that, but many countries have also tried to just make it more clear on how to get into the country through, say, what FDA has done through emergency use authorizations to help expand and meet a very critical need during the pandemic. And those are things that each country, I think, looks at individually as well. And we do try to communicate it through organizations like GHWP and Imdrf to understand how can we get common principles across, and how can we get confidence in other national body approaches of conformity assessment to get into our country, so we can, quote unquote, waive our process to get those products into the country during this critical need. And that was one of the tactics used through our approach to help get, say, masks and different materials into the country.
Thank you, Scott. The next question says, if you would have the opportunity to decide whether to continue the path of recognition of standards versus developing your own regulations, which which one would you choose? And what would be the rationale behind that?
Well, standards, I think. We both say, right, Donna?
Absolutely.
And here's the reason why. To develop a rule is beyond just the effort that is echelons more complicated. It takes a long time to get to a final rule. It may take 5 years or even 10 years. And if you're citing a standard in that rule, that standard might have 2 new additions before that rule is finally published. And now you have a rule that's already outdated. The same could be true if you're not even citing a standard in a rule and you're just citing the methodologies and so forth. I think there's an important place for rulemaking and an important place for standards, and we need to make sure that they are converging in a way that are complementary. The rules should designate what is needed, and the standards show you how it's done. It's the recipe of how you get there and provides those end solutions. But the what is required can be what's in the rule, and try not to cite a standard in that, but cite just what needs to be done, what needs to be demonstrated for you to be able to get the information necessary to assess. Standards in our recognition process, because it's very agile, we can continually keep up with current standards, allows us to feed into that. And it is a long-standing approach that we have had versus writing more and more rules all the time, but try to incorporate those. And that isn't just an FDA tactic, but actually something supported through the OMB circular that we mentioned earlier, and the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act that was written way back in the mid-90s that really showed that we do much better when we try to use the public-private partnerships that standards bring to the table. FDA has a bad history of trying to write its own performance standards in rulemaking. In 1997, we were authorized through law to do just that, to make up our own rules for performance. And over the course of 9 years, we wrote 0. I almost put 1, but that 1 ended up being a standard cited into the rule. We're not designed to do that. And it takes too much time and effort to do it appropriately. Doing it in the standards environment is far better. And we can utilize those principles that are commonly used around the world and incorporate them into our processes that way.
And maybe one follow-up question to that. What would you say the biggest positive changes or benefits have been in the last 25 years since the mandate to recognize standards for FDA?
Well, I'll go, and I'd like to hear Donna too, because she's had it from a much different perspective as a researcher of many decades. But I think standards provides the platform to really expand the knowledge base and be involved in a global industry that is global, and it's a global regulatory industry as well. Standards has really become the underpinnings to help foster trade, to help improve dialogues. It helps create it even pushes down language barriers. It makes it a lot easier for us to translate, because a lot of times the background of standards is utilization of math, and math is a common language that we can all agree upon when we're looking at what is safe, and all those aspects become very important. Our use of standards is really the bread and butter of what we do in assessing the safety and effectiveness of a product. It becomes our way of also advancing our knowledge and principles of how we can be a good regulator. It helps us manage how we look at risk, and it helps us do it in conjunction with the stakeholders that we are doing this with across industry and academia and patients and users. So, Donna, I don't know if you had another thought on it.
Yeah, just from a laboratory test method development or data collection perspective, participating in the standards environment opens up a whole wealth of additional testing laboratories, so you can do much more easily perform an interlaboratory study where you test the test method, and you get the different laboratories who are also participating in this standards development rather than just relying on the one laboratory. So it just makes the whole process a lot easier.
Thank you. I know we're almost at time, and I want to leave some time at the end to make sure we do some closing remarks. But we do have, I think, 4 more questions, and we'll try to maybe give another few minutes
Sure.
to answer some of those questions. So the next question, Patty, do you mind?
Yeah.
reading that one?
Next
Thank you.
question is, are there IMDRF documents that FDA has deemed mandatory? For instance, are medical devices manufacturers required to comply with all the essential principles of safety and performance?
No, it's a great question. The short answer is no. We have not made any of the documents required. And in fact, even as a federal agency, there are challenges in bringing in documents from other organizations to make them part of our business process, but we are working on that. Guidance from IMDrf is similar to guidance from FDA. It helps support our current thinking. We are encouraging the use of the essential principles because we believe it will become a foundational element of things like the single review platform, which we are also in support of. It helps create that common communication tool on what are those basic requirements that help meet the needs of the members that were at least involved in doing this. We know there's a history with the essential principles from GHTF that translated into the ISO 16142 series as well, that many the USAID and Standards Alliance projects has helped use over the years. And that document is actually up for revision right now to try to figure out how to pull in more current use of the essential principles, such as the IMDrf guidance. And we are actively working with the IMDrf working group and other experts from the ISO committee TC 210 working group 2, which I just happen to also be the convener of. And in updating that document, we feel that the essential principles is a path forward for us in standards development and communication to different regulators if we have common agreements on what are those important elements that a medical device or technology should utilize. So I would say that is an area, if you wanted to get involved in, that I would strongly encourage, because it will help you understand how we utilize standards to meet needs that are common principles by many regulatory authorities across the world.
Thank you, Scott. Next question, as you have mentioned the relevance of using international standards to favor trade, is there any type of interaction that FDA has with the TBT committee to prevent the development of barriers among their members?
Probably say, Vesa and Catherine, you might have a closer alliance with some of our work with our international folks, but we support, when we get to those trade discussions, many times that's a larger than FDA issue, and we work with our US trade representative offices, but we also, in helping support what is the issue that we feel may be present, we listen to our stakeholders, whether it's industries, standard developing organizations in many cases, because of how that impacts the operations that we have, which helps us also to engage with international organizations like ISO and IEC to make them aware, because usually if there's an issue that we find, it's probably also being seen by dozens of other countries, and bringing that right up to the top if it's a standards related issue may help us by getting their voice brought into the discussion as well, because the WTO is also engaged with ISO and IEC. And so our role has always been seen to try to bring in the stakeholders that need to hear about this, and then communicate through our channels, which is to the USTR, any interpretation of that. And we work through our international affairs office, who are phenomenal experts in this space, and also with our organizations and folks that are here on the phone that are part of that effort as well.
Thank you. So the next question, is there any liaising or communication mechanism between the manufacturers and the FDA that allows for the communication throughout the design and manufacturing of new technologies?
I would say FDA has a very good relationship with its stakeholders, and many of our stakeholders have consortium groups like trade associations, for example, at the national and global level. And there's a very open process in trying to have discussions on newer technologies, how to approach them, how to develop them, and where would it be best suited to do that kind of work. So the short answer is yes, and we do that in our program through organizations with the standards, but in many of our case, our trade associations also have standards working groups that have their members there. So we talk about principles of how to put standards to work versus how to develop the standard. But we bring those principles together also to maybe have discussions on challenging updates that may need to go into standards. And then we bring that into the standard development process. Communication requires, it being it's not just even a two-way street. It's multi-pronged, multi-directional, but being involved with it helps us the most in making sure that we're making a responsible determination of where to put our resources and how we can have our stakeholders actually speak for us in many cases as well, because we have common agreements on what are the issues and how to address them. And that requires us then not to have to be at the table.
Thank you. And the last one. What can do a regulator when they don't have the technology needed for a methodology that is suggested by a manufacturer of an innovative product?
Donna, did you want to try to take that or you want me to?
I'm not sure I quite understood the question.
If a manufacturer of an innovative product suggests a specific methodology for testing their product, and the FDA doesn't have either the technology or the knowledge to fully apply or perform that kind of method, what should we do? Do we accept that method? Should we ask the manufacturer to change it for another method?
From a standards platform, we would treat something like this similar to our general use provision, right, Donna? I just want to make sure I'm on that right line. Standards that we have not recognized or have actively said we do not recognize are treated like, we don't prohibit their use, but their use may require more information to support their use, such as a complete test report that goes into greater detail about how the protocols were developed from the method that was selected, and that whole process. And we actually have a guidance document on information to support testing, whether it's bench testing or other types of testing, and the level of content that is necessary. I don't know if we have that in our resource document actually, but we could try to provide that to this group. But we do have guidance on what to do when you're trying to discuss a novel method or discuss an area that isn't covered by an existing guidance or standard, and what's the level of detail necessary to support that use. So that way you can have that communication on a platform that we know how to walk through with you. And it's designed to help support or supplement that type of approach.
Thank you. No more questions.
Thank you. I want to really thank Donna and Scott for their presentations today. This brings us to the conclusion of the session. And as Donna and Scott presented today, standards are a big part of what FDA does, and accurate use of standards makes the process more efficient in review of products prior to entering the market. Using Sdos have created a system that is transparent and less burdensome for regulators and industry, which supports rapid access of new and innovative medical devices. And as Scott mentioned, we have seen a lot of the benefits since we engaged in standards, and we encourage the participation of our colleagues, regulators, and industry to engage in these activities as well. I would like to thank you all for the participation today. I think there were some really good questions and discussions that we had. I would like to remind you to provide feedback after this session. There's going to be an ability for you to do that. This is really, really important because we will utilize that feedback to develop the next sessions to come and make sure that we cover and provide more details in the areas where US participants see a benefit. And so please provide the feedback. We will welcome feedback regarding this session or next sessions to come if there is specific item or topic regarding this area that you would like to see us cover. With that, again, thank you all. I will invite Sandra and see if she has any other remarks before concluding the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Besa, and really nothing less than just sharing our appreciation for all the support that the team at the FDA is providing to the capacity building efforts of the coalition. I have been absolutely delighted listening to all the presentations and the really great discussion around the questions that have been asked. Of course, this only allows us to think that there is really way to go into this learning journey. And in the efforts that jointly regulators and industry have to perform in order to get a better way to serve the patients around the globe. So we're really very appreciative. We're very thankful for all your support. And just reconfirming what Bess is mentioning, please let us know the specific items that in this area of standards and conformity assessment you are interested in learning further, so we may prepare the forthcoming events to respond to those inquiries. So thank you very much. And on behalf of the Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project for COVID-19, thank you very much for having been here with us, and look forward for our next session. And as most probably it is going to happen in 2022, happy holidays for all of you and the best for the next year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.